Hi, everyone. Chris Quarto here, and welcome to another episode of the Adult Autism, a Spectrum of Uniqueness podcast. As a neurotypical person, it's not always clear what makes for good communication with autistic people. Unless you've grown up with somebody who's autistic or had some other kind of personal experience with these folks, you wouldn't necessarily know how best to communicate with them. And you know what? Autistic people get blamed for this a lot of the time, but it's not fair that they get all the blame. Neurotypical people play just as big of a role in communication challenges. I wanted to address some of these issues that show up in families, friendships, in the workplace, and maybe point out some things that both neurotypical and autistic folks can do to improve their relationships. It's possible that you won't agree with everything I say in this podcast episode, but I'll try to provide reasons for my takes on things as I go along. Okay, so you may have heard of something before called the double empathy problem, which suggests that people with different neurotypes, neurotypical and neurodivergent, have difficulty understanding and communicating with each other. There's a lack of mutual understanding between these folks based on differences in communication style, as well as behavioral and personality characteristics and personal experiences, of course. Actually, let's take into consideration a behavioral characteristic that's stereotypical of autistic folks, that being poor eye contact. And I say stereotypical because it's not true of all autistic people, but we'll just use it for this example. If an autistic person doesn't maintain good eye contact during conversations, a neurotypical person could easily misinterpret this as a lack of interest in what they're communicating to them, or perhaps that, I don't know, the autistic person doesn't have good self confidence. But if you look at it from the perspective of the autistic person, they might find it difficult to understand why it's necessary to do that, or to do what's ever considered normal communication, because they're just doing what's normal for them and their neurotype. Not to mention that it might be easier for them to focus and to process on what they want to say if they don't make eye contact. Now, unfortunately, poor eye contact and other violations of neurotypical norms can easily be equated with mental health problems, which might make a neurotypical person feel uncomfortable and concerned about what they're witnessing when they're talking to an autistic person. Now, does this mean that it's the autistic person's responsibility to change their behavior to be more normal? No. However, neurotypical people will probably need some context or an understanding of what's going on whenever possible, because it'll help them broaden their view of more non traditional forms of behavior, not just tolerate it, but to accept and appreciate people for who they are and what makes them unique. It's valuing and embracing differences is what it's all about. Just like you learn and appreciate people who are from different cultures. You might feel like they should do things your way, but they might feel the same way if you look at it from their perspective. Okay? Goes both ways. It can be a dilemma for an autistic person to figure out how to interact with neurotypical people. Like, should they tell a neurotypical person that they're autistic or not disclose this and allow them to figure this out for themselves at the risk of the neurotypical person believing that there's something wrong with them? Well, here's the thing. When an autistic person takes a proactive approach by telling a neurotypical person that they're autistic, it could really open up lines of communication. An autistic person might be more willing to do this if they see this as an opportunity to educate the other person, but only if they believe that nothing bad will come out of it, which may have happened a lot in the past. And you know what? That's obviously easier said than done. There's certainly a risk involved in doing this. So, making a determination as to whom to disclose to is really important. This is assuming, of course, that the neurotypical person has an interest in developing a relationship with the autistic person and is open to learning about, what makes this person unique. So, how would an autistic person know who to tell that they're autistic? Well, here's something that they could consider. What's the probability that if they disclose this information, that the neurotypical person will react negatively, like be judgmental, versus being appreciative and respectful of the autistic person's form of communication and way of interacting with people? You can get a sense of that with some people. Now, here are some other things to consider. Does the neurotypical person use respectful language and appear to be an empathic and understanding type of person? How do they talk about famous autistic people? Like, for example, if you, as the autistic person, bring up Elon Musk, who at the time of this recording is associated with Donald Trump, so that might not be a positive thing for some people. But how about if you brought up some other fictional character who's autistic or autistic alike? Like if you remember Sheldon Cooper from that old sitcom, The Big Bang Theory, if the person says something like, "Oh, I love that character," that's at least a piece of data that demonstrates a positive attitude or positive view toward neurodiversity. Here's another thing. Does the neurotypical person appear to be open minded and curious? Or are they more closed minded and dismissive? An autistic person could also test the waters, so to speak, by mentioning their sensory sensitivities that might have, or maybe that they get overly stimulated by certain things, and see how the person responds. In particular, are they supportive? Do they want to be accommodating? Or do they seem to ignore or downplay the autistic person's needs, your needs, if this was you in this situation? Now, it's not all that uncommon for an autistic person to experience social anxiety when they meet new people or they're in groups of people due to their awareness of their differences and probably negative reactions they've received from other people in the past. Now, having said this, it's just as likely that neurotypical people might feel uneasy about what to do, what to say when they interact with an autistic person, given that the typical rules of communication or interactional patterns don't necessarily apply, or at least apply in a way that they're used to. Well, if you consider how communication is a bi-directional process, meaning that person A says something to person B, and person B in turn responds to that communication and kind of goes back and forth like that, then each person has a responsibility to do what they need to do to ensure that their communications are as clear as possible. Now, having said this, the neurotypical person probably has a little more responsibility along these lines because they're not having to juggle as many things when they're trying to get things across to people. And, some of that old baggage, like having been bullied in the past, which is so typical of autistic folks. They don't have to deal with that kind of stuff. Now, kind of along these lines, it's important for neurotypical people to understand that they may inadvertently say or do something that's triggering or maybe overstimulating to an autistic person, and to be aware of this when they interact with them. And in fact, an autistic person may eventually communicate this to them as a way of establishing new rules of engagements, so to speak, so they feel safe and comfortable talking to that person moving forward. Um, Another challenge for autistic people is being able to decipher the meaning of certain verbal and nonverbal behaviors of people that they're interacting with. Because human communication is so complex, it's not possible for a person to use one rule to conclude that behavior A always means this or that. And so it may be important for a neurotypical person to clarify their intent. If a message came across as unclear, or just to anticipate and be on the lookout for instances in which the autistic person may be confused, and maybe take the opportunity to do what amounts to a preemptive strike by explaining what they meant whenever it's necessary to do that. Now, sometimes autistic people benefit from and appreciate clear communication, so they're not having to play, the guessing game. In some cases, autistic people may retreat into their own heads in situations where they're feeling uncomfortable, like maybe when they're talking to a person and having difficulty understanding them, or simply don't jive with how they communicate or act. So, if the neurotypical person can sense this is happening when they're talking to an autistic person, then they might consider deferring to that person so they don't feel overwhelmed, so they don't feel anxious or experience some other negative feeling. It's analogous to shifting gears in a manual transmission car to adjust to changes in speed limits or driving conditions. Okay, now this is where some of you may disagree with my take on an issue, but give me a chance to explain myself to see if it makes any sense or any difference to you. In some cases, autistic people benefit from having a map or scripts in terms of what they can say or do in certain situations. Now, scripts won't apply to all situations, but general scripts can be useful in situations where a person is maybe meeting new people and has to engage in that idle chit chat and that sort of thing. Now, having said this, some autistic people don't feel like they should have to mask or hide their true selves by way of scripting, and I totally understand that, respect that. I try to look at things practically, and that some neurotypical people, unfortunately, are judgmental, and first impressions carry a lot of weight with them. And so it might make sense for an autistic person to use a script when they at least first meet someone. And I really hesitate to say that because I don't want to come across as ableist. I'm really just throwing this out there as a strategic maneuver because of how neurotypical people can be real assholes at times. The idea is for an autistic person to gradually allow their true self to emerge as they get to know the person. What I was saying before in terms of how to determine whether it's safe to take off the mask, so to speak, applies in this situation. I'm curious to hear your thoughts about this, good or bad, because once again, I'm not trying to be ableist by any account. Now, not everything should fall on the shoulders of an autistic person. A neurotypical person who knows that they'll be talking to an autistic person might benefit from having some general approaches that they use that govern their interactions. So, for example, understanding that an autistic person may say or do things that don't necessarily conform to normal rules of conversation should be anticipated and even celebrated. Going with the flow, that's an important rule to abide by when interacting with somebody who's trying to find their way in social engagement or simply um, communicating in a way that makes sense to them. While some autistic people use masking strategies to cloak their true selves, a neurotypical person who's aware of their uniqueness can communicate with them in an open and accepting manner. So the autistic person won't feel the need to wear the mask and can be their authentic self as time wears on. This is kind of what we want to see happen. Here's another thing to think about. Some autistic folks need time to observe, to wait, and to listen to what's going on around them to determine if and how they should interact with neurotypical people. In some cases, this gives them time to determine what kind of a mask to wear, if that's something they feel like they need to do or want to do. They may or may not want to do that. It's really their choice. Also, it allows them to have internal dialogue to determine what's going on, what they think about the situation, and how to proceed. Now, unfortunately, some of this internal dialogue may be negative regarding how they think about themselves or their inability to handle the situation the way that they think it should be handled. And in other situations, it's simply a method of regulating cognitively and emotionally to prepare them to deal with the situation as best as they can. Now, for a neurotypical person, it's important to be genuinely curious about the interest of autistic people and to learn enough about them to inquire about those interests as a way not only to get to know them, but to make them feel respected and comfortable with verbal give and take. It's even more amazing if the neurotypical person can find something in common with their autistic counterpart, given that mutual interests can form the basis of a friendship. Now, one of the last things I want to point out is that some autistic people are direct, if not blunt, when expressing themselves to people. Now, this can be off putting to a neurotypical person, but the challenge is to reframe this in positive terms, and that the person is just being honest. They're not playing games, which is so typical of many social interactions. And that relates to what I mentioned earlier in regard to being open to diverse forms of social communication on the parts of autistic people and celebrating those differences. This isn't always easy to do, though, and if the neurotypical person feels offended by what the autistic person said, and so this can certainly be something that's pointed out to them as part of open and honest conversation. Now, the fact that an autistic person doesn't abide by all rules of social communication isn't such a bad thing. And in fact, perhaps it's better to get away from the notion that social communication has to occur in a certain way. Being open to diversity and communication, that's what allows autistic people to be their true, authentic selves. And isn't that something we should want for all people? Well, I hope you took away some useful tidbits in this podcast episode. I think the main things I wanted to get across is that it's just not up to an autistic person to change the way they communicate with neurotypical people to form and develop relationships, which is what is so often recommended by therapists and other people. Neurotypical people have just as much of a responsibility to alter their communication patterns with autistic people as needed. In fact, um, this could change things for the better in families, friendships, and in the workplace. Well, thanks again for joining me. And remember, your uniqueness is awesome.